Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. We'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on monetary and non-monetary factors influencing travel choices in an automated, shared, and electric vehicle future. My name is Mike Centetos. I'm the Policy Director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm just going to do a quick introduction here before we get started, let you know who we are. So this is a monthly webinar series that we do, sponsored by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. We're part of the University Transportation Centers program, which is administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And we're a consortium of 6 universities around the country focused on advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. Today's webinar is going to be 1 hour. We'll have a presentation from Dr. Lou Fulton and Unia Compostela from UC Davis. We were going to have some remarks from our guest respondent who had been involved in this work, Tim Wallington of Ford, but he ended up having a conflict. So we're going to have a little extra time for Q&A. And we'll do Q&A following the presentation. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom webinar platform. We encourage you to type in your questions there at any time, and we'll do our best to get to all of them following the presentation. We will be recording this webinar. The slides will be available and the recording on our website following the presentation. And with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So we're going to hear a research presentation that will be kind of divvied up between our 2 presenters here. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Lou Fulton. He's the director of the Sustainable Transportation Energy Pathways Program and the Energy Futures Program at the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California, Davis. And then we're going to hear from Unia Compostela, a PhD candidate who is also with the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis and the 3 Revolutions Future Mobility Program. So Lou, I will turn it over to you and go ahead and share your screen and take us away.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar this morning. And we do have lots to share. We'll do it where I present for some of it and then turn it over to Unia, who will present some of the more complex stuff, and then back to me to finish up. Hopefully we can do that in a timely way and save lots of time for questions. We're going to cover this topic, monetary, non-monetary factors influencing travel choices, with a particular emphasis on thinking about automated, shared, and electric vehicle futures. We're actually going to think about near term and longer term. And in near term, we won't think about automated, but we'll think about shared and electric, and shared meaning ride hailing, really, and ride sourcing. And then in the longer term, bringing in the automated vehicles. So there's been plenty of research on the costs of different mode choices, and a fair bit of it has focused on costs associated with light-duty vehicle trips. There's a growing literature on ride hailing, and there are some other studies that are getting into electrification, future automation of vehicles. But we do think that the work we're presenting today is new and adding some interesting insights into that combination of these different ways of traveling. We're not looking today at things like transit or micromobility. We are focused on, let's say, passenger vehicle travel and keeping it in that realm. We're going to look at monetary and non-monetary costs that we've estimated. We don't have really time to get into the literature, although in our papers, we certainly do that. And then we're going to think about implications for policy and future research. There are actually 3 papers that we will reference today. One of them is the NCST paper that was published earlier this year, or very late last year, I guess. And I'll start by showing a couple of things from that study, and then we'll get into 2 related studies that were published in Transport Policy, one focused on monetary costs and the other on non-monetary, mainly travel time oriented costs, but actually combining both monetary and non-monetary costs. So, well, what is the framework here? What are we trying to, what problems are we looking at, or what issues are we looking at? And it really comes down to that you've got these three revolutions. Ride hailing is part of that revolution, ride sourcing and sharing, vehicle electrification, and eventual automation of vehicles. It might be level 4, level 5 automation that we're thinking about here, where it's basically driverless. They're all going to change the way we travel, or they are changing the way we travel. And of course, ride hailing offers access to a car without the ownership, or without having to drive it, for that matter, if it's a actual ride hail situation. Electric vehicles do reduce energy use, and at least in California, they reduce, certainly anywhere they reduce pollutant emissions, because there are none from the tailpipe, but they usually reduce CO2 emissions, or will do. And in this state, they already do quite a bit. Together, ride hailing and automated vehicles, AVs, might affect traffic patterns. And so there's a lot of reasons to want to know how people are going to choose among these options and what the factors might be. We're not looking at exactly how this might affect travel patterns, or traffic patterns, but we're trying to understand what influences people's choices. I would also say that we're trying to understand, as I mentioned, the near term and then a longer term. Near term is sort of the present 2020 timeframe, and then longer term might be 2030, 2035 timeframe, whenever there are widespread availability of automated vehicles. But we also look at cost reduction for those vehicles and for electric vehicles into the future, and how that might affect choices. As I mentioned, we do not include automated vehicles in our near-term estimates, and we only look at automated vehicles for this longer-term comparison. So when you think of monetary and non-monetary costs, you've got a range of factors, and I'll briefly go through those. There are situational factors having to do with buying a vehicle or choosing how you're going to take a particular trip. And then there are various psychological factors that may be more enduring or similar across kinds of trips. The situational factors are very important, because the kinds of trips we take vary dramatically, and their length, their purpose, all kinds of things. And we are presenting typically averages that we acknowledge are masking a wide range of possible situations. And then there's the monetary and the non-monetary factors. And as I'll show in a second, there's a very wide range of non-monetary factors, and we're only beginning to get into some of them, mainly the ones focused on travel, time, and other aspects of a trip that are time and time value related. This busy slide is from our NCST paper, where we attempted to create a typology of different kinds of costs, building on other efforts to do that in the literature, but adding some things that maybe people haven't thought much about. In the rows here, you've got monetary costs, you've got non-monetary costs that are related to time value, and then other things that are not related to trips or to the time associated with trips. And so that could even include, as you see in that bottom left box, car ownership, pride. There's research on the pride of car ownership that may be very important in terms of people's decision whether or not to own a vehicle. That is very hard to quantify, and we're not trying to do that here. But going across, we've got in the columns, we've got things that are separate from or unrelated to specific trips. There are things that are proportional to the number of trips, but maybe not paid for specifically for each trip. Things that are paid only once or twice a year, once or twice a trip, such as the blue ones, which are related specifically to TNC or ride-hailing trips, like the first mile fee. They also could be parking costs, that sort of thing. Things that are lumpy, paid only on some trips. And then finally, things that can or should be measured per mile, or maybe not, but in a lot of cases, you can measure them per mile. Fuel cost is interesting because it's very much a per mile cost, but we actually only pay it when we refuel. So I won't go into any details here. This is in the NCST paper, and there's just a lot of different things. And we're going to focus pretty much on the first two rows here and on various monetary and time-related non-monetary costs. And to get our next phase of the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Unia.
Thank you, Lou. So we're going to move forward with this presentation, a deep dive on the monetary costs. So the research questions around the monetary cost investigations are what are the costs of owning and operating a private vehicle, the cost of ride hailing, how they compare with each other, and then we project those in a hypothetical future automated scenario. Next slide, please. And then the second deep dive will be adding the value of travel times in different trip stages to the cost of travel. So how does this value of travel time affect the overall cost of travel, again, with private and ride hailing? And then accounting for the value of travel time, how this will evolve in the automated future. Then we wanted to consider the effect of road fees. So we consider a list of like different road fees, and then we will see how they affect the overall cost of traveling with private and ride hailing. So we will create an overall model that simulates the cost of travel, again with private and ride hailing. So it has two components, the monetary cost part and the value of travel time plus road fee cost. Okay, so we can move forward with and then start to investigate the monetary cost. Monetary cost, so we did a very detailed analysis that it's published in this paper that you see here on the right. And we consider the vehicle size classes. So we analyze the mid-size car, a small SUV, and a mid-size SUV, different powertrains, the traditional gasoline, hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and then battery electric, different mileage range. Then different fuels, gasoline and electricity, modes, as we said, ride hailing, solo and pooled versus private vehicle. And then again, two different scenarios, the traditional driven around 2020, and then a future complete full driverless level 4 or 5 projected in a 2030, 2035 scenario. So here we can see some base case assumptions for our investigation. So first of all, the vehicle manufacturer costs were estimated with a software autonomy that is developed by Argonne National Laboratory. We included an annual depreciation rate of 17.5% for private vehicle, and we did not consider any residual value for ride hailing. We also accounted for some discount into the future of a 5% rate and for vehicle cost and fuel cost. And then in terms of mileage, we consider 15,000 miles for the personal vehicles and 80,000 miles per year for ride-hailing vehicles. We consider a lifespan of 5 years. The cost of pool ride hailing is 40% the one of solo ride hailing, and then we included a provider overhead that is equal to 35% of the fare. Okay, so those are the first main monetary cost findings in the current non-driverless scenario. So we noticed that traveling with a private ICEV, so traditional gasoline, is the least expensive choice. Gasoline costs for a private vehicle is 3.3 times the cost of electricity. The depreciation cost of a battery electric, it's 2.3 the one of ICEV. Mainly because of the battery cost. Solo ride hailing are 4 to 5 times the cost of driving a private vehicle, and then pool cost was down to 3 times. And then the cost of ride hailing driving and provider overhead make up for 90%, so it's almost the full cost of ride hailing. Move on to the next slide. Then we move to the future, again, the 2030, 2035 completely driverless scenario. And so we included a $10,000 per vehicle additional cost for the AV technologies. which could be expensive, but spread over the lifespan of the vehicle, we can see that the bright pink, it's actually not very high on the overall cost per mile. We noticed that automation can be very attractive for ride hailing in particular, more than personal vehicle. And then the cost of a private vehicle is 1.3, the one of solo ride hailing, and 2.2, the one of pool ride hailing. And the battery electric has cost advantages over the ICE EV. Therefore, we can tell that the economics could impel automated services providers to deploy electric automated vehicles. Okay, then we can move to the second phase of the investigation, which is the one related to the vehicle, the valid travel time, that we will add to the monetary cost that we just saw. So for the valid travel time, we included different trip stages, the traditional in-vehicle travel time, waiting time, walking time, the time arrival penalty that is typical of pool ride hailing, and then the time to search for a parking. Next slide, please. So just to show you the overall cost that we will see in the next slides, it's given by the monetary cost. We consider the mid-size car, again, for the two modes, private and solo, ride-hailing, solo and pool, two different powertrains, and then two different technologies, driven and automated. Then we added valid travel time with the breakdown into the different type of time, and then we add also the impact of road fees. We consider 4 different road fees: the congestion area, per trip fee, trip overhead fee, and a per mile fee that we will see in the next slide. So some key assumptions for this valid travel time. So for the drive for a personal vehicle, we consider the travel time cost equal to, for like about 50% of the income of an individual, while for the passenger scenario, the travel time cost, it's equal 70% of that one of the driver's travel time cost. We included 3 different income groups: lower, middle, and higher. Wait time at pickup point is 5 minutes. Walk time to and from the parking on or the pickup or drop-off place, it's 1.5 minutes. Walking and waiting time multipliers, we included 2.2 and 2.1 respectively. We included a penalty arrival time for pool of 3.6 minutes. Time to search for parking, it's 2 minutes, and then 2 different trip lengths, shorter and longer, 3 miles and 15 miles. So we will see in the next slides. Okay, so here we can see the first findings of the non-automated scenario, again, for 2020. Here we have these 2 charts. On the left, we have the shorter 3-mile trip, and then on the right, we have the longer 15-mile. And we see that the driving a personal car is the most attractive mode for all income people. Next slide, please. We also noticed that ride-hailing becomes much less competitive compared to private vehicle as the trip length increases and the income decreases. We can see, so there is a black dotted line that shows if essentially the driver does not consider the monetary component of the vehicle. So today I decide to use my car, and then I don't think about the monetary component of the car, clearly like the fixed part of the monetary component. So then the perceived cost becomes lower. So let's move to the next slide. And then the last main finding is that the monetary cost is still very critical on the overall cost of ride hailing. Okay, so we can move to the next slide.
I just want to throw in one comment there, Yunia, that when we saw only the monetary costs, the pooled ride hailing looked best, but once we have the time costs, it doesn't anymore. So I think that's also a really key finding that the private vehicles now look the best.
Right. Okay. So what do we notice here? That accounting for the time cost, pool ride hailing turns not to be competitive for any income group. And we would need a much higher fee to make pool ride hailing appealing. So in order to observe and investigate these aspects, we did some analysis with the current road fees. So we created this big list of like road fees that are around the world. And so we can see in the next slide that after considering all these possible road fees that are in place today, only the one in London, which is the congestion area fee, that is $15 per day, not applicable to pool, makes driving less appealing than pool in shorter and longer trips for all income level. This means that any other fees that are today considered by different municipalities around the world are not making pool attractive at all. So we need higher fees, and only the congestion fees so far has an effect. Then if we move to the next slide, we also notice that the per mile toll, considering a $1.25 per mile, and is split by 2 passengers if pool ride hailing, makes pool ride hailing competitive with driving, but only for longer trips, and is equally across the income group. So the income groups here is just to show, I don't know if it's very clear, but the blue line is for lower income group. The main bar sits for middle income group, and then the red line is the higher income group. So let's move next slide. So now we observe the AV components in the when we also consider for the value of travel time. So we show the case where AV solo ride hailing has up to 45% lower travel time cost than driving a manual vehicle. So this is our assumptions. The travel time cost in a privately owned vehicle is the same as solo AV ride hailing. And then pool ride hailing remains unchanged from the circa 2020 scenario, so the non-AV scenario, given the presence of other passengers that could limit the privates and productivity in the trip. So our main findings for the AV scenario, including the value of travel time, shows that for shorter trip, pool ride hailing is not attractive for any income group. Let's see the next slide. While for longer trips, pool ride hailing is attractive to the lower and middle income groups, yet the difference is very minimal, as we can see. Next slide, please. And then at last, like reflecting the fact that the travel time cost is lower in AVs, the relative contribution of monetary cost to the overall cost for a private vehicle is greater in 2030, 2035 scenarios of the AV than the traditional driven 2020 scenario, and lower for ride hailing. Okay.
We might also remind again that those dotted lines show that if people ignore the cost of buying that AV and are just thinking about their trip that day, it makes it even cheaper to own and choose your own AV to ride in.
Right. Okay. So who could be the early adopters? So the benefits of automation are, we notice that are larger for ride hailing than personal use from a monetary cost perspective. But as we could see from the dotted line, if people do not perceive the fixed monetary costs when using their own AVs, the perceived cost of owning an AV, it's lower than ride hailing. Okay, so I'm going to pass it back to Lou now.
Okay, so thank you, Unia. There was a lot there, and actually we got through it faster than I thought we would, so that's good, but we certainly can come back to any of those slides during the Q&A, because I'm sure there was a lot to digest there. The last little thing to present on all of this is we continue to explore some of the other types of costs. I'd say it's a very preliminary exploration that's in our NCST paper, but we were just trying to get some kind of a handle on things that are not time related per se, and maybe not related to every trip. And so we just came up with some heuristics, and you can see on the left, there are 6 of them where we made some simple assumptions about what might happen on average for public recharging stress. So searching for charging for your EV, and maybe some stress related to that increases your sense of time cost because you're nervous. General driving stress, people who don't like driving, and of course some people actually really like driving, so they might have a very perceived low cost of driving. That's not in this table. Waiting time when you have to repair your own vehicle that you would never have for ride hailing. Refueling and cleaning time for your own vehicle. Loading and unloading, which might take longer if it's not your own vehicle. The classic example being a child seat that you have to bring and put into the ride hail vehicle, but sits forever in your own vehicle. And then uncertain ride arrival time, apart from the normal average arrival time. And when we used these sets of assumptions and added it up, we found that basically they don't add up to a big number. It's under 10 cents per mile. And if we went back to the other figures, you'd see that that's relative to, with including time costs, over $1 per mile, maybe $1.50 per mile or more for these different modes. And so it doesn't look like any of these are massive game changers, but they could be in some situations. And in this set, with these assumptions, private AVs sort of win. It's interesting that privately owned automated vehicles seem to come up cheapest for many things. And then just the summary, I think basically Unia hit on all these points, and I'll just quickly repeat them. When we account for both monetary and non-monetary cost of travel time, in the current time frame, personal vehicle driving appears to be the most attractive mode for all income groups in most situations. Pooled ride hailing is somewhat attractive given the monetary cost savings, but there are significant time costs. In the future with automated vehicles, ride hailing trips become more attractive, except for pooled ride hailing, given the time costs. And for all income, that's true for all income groups and especially for shorter trips, reflecting the fact that travel time cost is lower in automated vehicles. If that turns out to really be true, that people perceive a lower per mile or per minute cost, the relative contribution of monetary cost rises. And that gives some advantage to any low monetary cost type of a trip. And actually AV travel will be cheap that way. If people don't perceive the fixed monetary cost of their own vehicle, so they're not worried about that they've already bought that vehicle and it's sitting in the driveway, then that becomes a very low cost option. And it means people are likely to want to own their own automated vehicle, except that if they have to think about buying that vehicle, that may change that a little bit. On the other side, since the monetary cost is much lower for automated vehicles, solo ride hailing, people might be very interested in traveling solo. The advantages of pooled ride hailing basically disappear in an automated vehicle future. So there are many other monetary costs. These costs vary a lot depending on the situation, and we've presented some averages, but we think there's some interesting findings here, basically needing more attention, more research, more situational analysis, and so on. So that's it. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both for a very insightful and meaty presentation. I think we'll probably be wanting to refer back to some of those slides as we go through some of these questions. So, I mean, maybe we can just start big picture here. You both talked about, you know, if you look just at the monetary costs of these different travel options, what might be kind of the most efficient or cost-effective way of traveling looks very different than if you start factoring in the cost of travel, some of these other non-monetary costs. So, you know, if governments or other entities are looking to encourage more efficient travel, encourage shared travel. Are some of these monetary tools like TNC fees, things like that, are those going to be effective, or do we need to be thinking about other types of incentives or policies to try to nudge travel behavior in a certain direction?
Uni, I'll let you take a crack each time, and if you wanted me to chime in,
sure.
I will.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Lou. So I think one of the most important finding is that, like, the slides on the road fees, that's a summary of a much bigger research. So we collected all the possible road fees that by the time that we published, we worked on this paper, were in place in different municipalities around the world. And what we notice is that as they are right now, they're not enough to essentially make a choice of using pool ride hailing, so shared with other people. They're not enough to make this appealing versus a solo or a traveling with a private vehicle. Which is so within the four wheels motorized scenario. So we're clearly not talking about like transit or micromobility in this paper. So this is again like another conversation, but within the context of private vehicles versus ride hailing, we wanted to go towards a pooled ride hailing scenario. The regulations and fees that we have right now are not enough. So definitely, probably working more on this kind of policies would be preferred, and to go towards a pool ride hailing scenario.
Yeah, and in this figure, this is showing, right? I've shared my screen. As Unia says, the UK congestion area fee really stands out because at $15 a day, it is powerful, but almost no per mile tolls that we reviewed in our lit review, and looking at the existing tolls out there. As Uni says, none of them really change the relative costs much. So, so yeah, like, time costs are critical.
Yeah, and so if you wanted to see all the, we have like the whole complete list of all the fees that we tolls fees that we consider in our analysis. It's in the paper that it's linked in the presentation that will be shared. So you can see the complete list over there.
So building on that a little bit in terms of other, incentives, disincentives, we got a question about the cost of parking and how that factors in. So if you talk a little bit about to what degree you consider the cost of parking, and maybe whether that kind of ceases to be an issue with automated vehicles.
Yeah, so maybe Lou, we can go back to the monetary cost slide so then we can see it better.
Is that a good one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for the so in this specific paper, we did not consider the cost of parking for the monetary side. We only consider the cost of parking for the time portion of this investigation, so it's the cost of parking in the form of searching for parking. So for this specific analysis, we did not include the cost of parking, but definitely the cost of parking will, and we did not include it because of the variation of the cost of parking depending on the geographical location. So we prefer not to include it in the analysis, but the cost of parking definitely will even increase even more the monetary costs for.
It's also important to mention that that there, we didn't include that one, but there are for the ones we included, we did quite a bit of sensitivity analysis, and we didn't have time to present it today, but we do try to look at what happens when you change assumptions on a lot of these things in the paper. And I think in those papers, and I think that's an interesting part of it, because you have to look at all kinds of different possible variations in some of these costs.
That's helpful. We did get a question or two about that sensitivity analysis piece. Maybe we can come back to that. We got a whole series of questions trying to kind of understand pieces of your analysis a little bit better. So maybe we can work through some of those. So one was about if you could just expand a little bit on why the cost of travel, the travel time cost is less for automated vehicles than for a driven vehicle.
Lou, do you want to go to the?
Sure. So the idea is, well, basically a driven vehicle, if you're driving, is kind of our base situation. And using a couple of studies, and one in particular that estimated how valuable it is to people on average to not have to do that driving, but to be a passenger, was what we based our change in travel time cost on. The part that's a little harder to know is whether it's going to be any different if you're the passenger in a driven vehicle. Could be your own vehicle and someone else in the family's driving and you're sitting as a passenger. And there's interesting literature on some of this, that if you're next to the driver, you have a certain role to play, and it may not be at all like being in a for-hire vehicle where you're more likely in the back seat, or even if it's your own vehicle and you're in the back seat, it might be different. But in any case, we basically assumed this almost around half cost reduction, time cost reduction, if you're not the driver, whether it's your own vehicle and you're a passenger, whether it's driven or whether it's automated. So we kept it fairly simple, but again, we did do some sensitivity analysis on that.
So the actual time you're in the car might be the same. It's just the cost of that time feels lower because you're not burdened by the tasks of driving.
Yeah, and that's very important. I mean, in all of these different choices, you have sometimes changes in the amount of time. Like you don't have to spend time searching for parking if it's a for-hire vehicle. And then there's the value of that time. So how many minutes and value per minute? We looked at both of those things.
Okay. Can you also talk about insurance costs and what maybe some of your assumptions were around those, especially if the vehicle is autonomous, and kind of what that might mean for insurance costs, or kind of how complex you considered that, or how much you dug into that?
Yeah, we certainly looked at it. Uni, go ahead.
For the automated scenario, we kept that constant because of the uncertainty around that. So there are too many uncertainties around what it will be, and so for now, at least, so we kept that cost constant.
But we acknowledge that if these automated vehicles become much safer, that you would expect insurance rates to go down. We just weren't there in terms of just assuming that happens.
Yeah, and also because there is a big debate on who's going to be the liability. So if there's anything that happens to a potential accident with an AV, so that it's true that like AV are supposed to be much safer, but the liability, it's not clear yet. So because of these two reasons, we decided to keep it constant.
Clearly a lot of unknowns surrounding that issue still.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got another question. Could you briefly talk about your estimation method for the non-monetary cost? I think that's maybe specifically referring to the cost of travel time. So can you talk a little bit more about how you arrived at those values?
Yeah, so Lou, would you mind to go to the assumption slide? And that'd be useful to.
Oops. Yeah, got to get my.
So, there you go. Okay, so so this is the base case for the value of travel time slide. So we're still in the current scenario, so 2020 driven scenario. So for the driving a personal vehicle, we considered 50% of the income. And then as you see here, we consider 3 income groups, a lower, this is the dollar per hour, the wage per hour, middle and higher. And then for the passenger scenarios, we considered that this costs 70% of the driver's travel time. So essentially becomes 70% of the 47.5% of the income. Then for wait time, so we're talking about solo ride-hailing. It's considered 5 minutes. Walk time, that is only for the pool ride-hailing scenario, and also for the parking in case of a private vehicle. We considered 1.5 minutes. Walking and waiting, we applied also 2 multipliers for walking and waiting. So it's a 2.2 and 2.1 respectively. Then for pool ride-hailing, we consider this penalty for arrival time. So the typical detour that is typical for pool ride-hailing. For time to search for parking, we included 2 minutes, and then 2 different lengths for but this is for the figures that we showed before, a shorter and longer trip, 3 and 15 miles. This is the base case of our assumptions. Yeah.
We got a couple additional questions on value of travel time that, at least for me, kind of hits home just how complicated it is to try to put numbers to some of these things. But the question is whether you consider like different trip types in terms of like, you know, maybe the value of time would be different for like a business trip or going, you know, traveling for work versus pleasure versus shopping or something like that.
Yes, so so in here we show the personal type of trip, so like personal, like leisure or something that is not related to business or commuting. In the paper, we also have scenarios for business. So everything that you see here, it's also replicated for business trip, and then essentially the travel time cost increases in terms of percentages of the income. Yeah, so that's the main assumption. So we consider 2 different purposes, so business and personal. And
I think for the business ones, we were using some kind of value of time related to business travel, right?
Yeah. So we have assumptions that are specific to business.
Gotcha. Okay. So, you know,
I see there are so many specific questions. We could also answer some of them, you know, by typing in answers, but
sure. Yeah. Maybe there's a couple that I wanted to kind of zoom out on, maybe a little.
Sure.
Bit, a little more general. So the next one I think is related to what you're just talking about with the cost of travel time. You know, I guess basically maybe just trying to ground this in reality a little bit. Can you talk about kind of how, you know, evidence there is that travels actually take into account some of these non-monetary costs, and maybe what some of the literature says about, you know, about how values were assigned to some of these non-monetary factors, and just kind of whether, you know, yeah, well, maybe I'll leave it at that if that question makes sense.
Well, yeah, so I like to say that this is not a travel like behavior or attitudinal type of research. This is a projected scenario, what it could be. So we created a bunch of different assumptions as we talked to today, but this is not trying to prove any potential behavioral investigation or future behavior. So this is those are assumptions that shows what the cost could be, and then put into a context of a survey research that can be done in the future. using these assumptions, then we can test how people would react to this sort of assumption. So for future research, I could suggest something like a stated preference survey or a revealed preference survey to really investigate what the reaction of consumers could be.
And yeah, can I add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, but at the same time, we do use a lot of available attitudinal type survey research to help us with getting some estimates of values. And I think to Mike's question, we're keeping it kind of simple in the sense that once we established what we would use as the value of time, we mostly use that time value, and it varies, as Uni said, it varies by income level, for whether they're in the main part of the trip, whether they're walking to and from the car, whether they're parking, time value for parking. I think, Uni, don't we use the same value of time for a given income regardless of which phase of the trip it is?
Right. So the time that varies is the in-vehicle travel time, but then the multipliers and then the walking time, or like, the minutes that are added for the specific segment of the trip, it's kept equal for the different.
Yeah, and I mean the value per minute, actually. But yes, in different situations that we looked at, some of the minutes vary. Obviously, the length of the trip has a big impact on how long that trip is and how much cost the main body of the trip has. And that was one thing that affected the results on a relatively pretty short trip, 3 miles versus our longer 15-mile trip. Walking to and from car may not be any different in those two trips, but the amount of time in the vehicle is vastly different. So it gives you a sense of how the results change depending on those situations. So we were looking more at that, how situational changes seem to affect the relative costs.
And I mean, it sounds like, all these values could certainly be refined, and I think some of the questions have alluded to different situations or circumstances where the values could be different, even for the same person. But I think for me, the bottom line is, prior research has shown that all of these factors do matter, right? They do factor into people's travel decisions. And so, just focusing on, the monetary factors that influence people's travel decisions is really, you're missing a lot of what goes into the decisions people make, right? And all these other factors that you all have started to tease out here are in some cases maybe just as big as the monetary factors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you just look at the monetary, like this one, you get one sense of relative cost. And if you look at non-monetary, like this one, you get a different sense of it. I mean, it doesn't completely change everything, but the non-monetary costs are very important. And, even if you had a lower value of travel time than we have, and I think you could often have a significantly higher value of travel time, you really need to be looking at those costs. And I think also, very importantly, we're not including all of them. There are so many different kinds of things that could affect, in this broad sense of cost, how people are making their choices.
Yes.
So one more kind of methodological question is about the relative costs of battery electric vehicles versus conventional internal combustion engine vehicles, and how you arrive. I think one of those slides showed that electric vehicles were a little more expensive, right? Could you talk about what some of the factors were that kind of bumped up the cost of battery electric vehicles?
Yeah, I see. Go ahead.
No, what I was saying is that we considered, we used this software autonomy that is developed by the Argonne National Laboratory. And so the cost of the batteries clearly goes down a lot into the 2 time frames. However, here we see that in the beginning, the cost of the battery is what makes it more costly. and it represents around 6% of this price difference for the cost of manufacture.
And what this slide shows is that yes, battery electric vehicles are more expensive to buy. They're already cheaper to operate, but those costs aren't that different. We focus a lot on the extra costs of battery electric vehicles, but they're not that critical when you compare it to other things. And then if you look into the future, they'll go away. We end up with them still tiny bit more in our longer term, but they may end up being cheaper. This data are about a year old. Battery cost projections keep dropping so much that probably that battery private BEV bar would keep coming down more than we think. And
as well as the cost of fuel, that you can see that here in the specific picture, this is the future. So the cost of fuel, we can see that it decreases if like ICE versus BEV. So that in a way levelize the still some additional value coming from the vehicle itself.
Yeah, and actually I'm seeing one question now that from Paul Ivy that suddenly I'm realizing what the question is. So in this figure, you can see that the cost of battery electric vehicles is pretty good for ride hailing and pretty good for pooled ride hailing. First of all, in general, the cost of the car is lower because per mile you're amortizing it over many more miles more quickly. So that's one thing, that those vehicle costs are coming down. And then for the pool trips, you're dividing all of the costs by more people. So that helps to bring the costs down. And I'm trying to remember why it is true that our battery electric vehicle costs, Unia, for ride hailing, let's say compared to an ICE vehicle, are quite a bit lower. And I'm trying to remember why. I can't remember offhand, but I see that I guess it's just that the vehicles travel so far. The vehicles are traveling so far every year that you can see here the fuel cost is a lot lower. Everything else is pretty much the same, except the provider fee, the provider overhead is treated as a percentage of all other costs. So that percentage results in a slightly smaller light beige bar there because it's a percentage off a smaller number. But it's really about the energy costs. Yeah.
Great. And I'll just say, I mean, there are several other questions asking about some of the specific numbers you presented, and we may or may not have time to get to all of them, but you have links to where these papers are, so feel free to dig in. And then the presentation also has contact information for Lou and Unia. So
yeah, we're happy to be inundated with emails and questions and whatever.
Yeah,
volunteer you both for that.
Yeah.
So we have kind of an interesting question that maybe is a little bit beyond the work that you all did, and so maybe it would be asking you to speculate a little bit, but I'll ask you anyway. So you looked at a number of options, of travel options that generally are kind of, you have some travel options in the ride hailing bucket where you're summoning a ride, and then you have some options in a private vehicle, private AV bucket. What if there was another option that's kind of this subscription-based, it's the vehicle is kind of on, the AV is kind of on demand for you, and you have a subscription with an OEM that allows you to kind of summon the vehicle, but it's kind of, maybe more of a personal vehicle than like a ride hailing. How would you envision an option like that maybe matching up against some of these other options that you consider off the cuff?
I could say something about that. I think in general, like, this is an economics analysis, and it's about cost. And although we're doing it mainly as averages, what you really want is to understand costs at the margin, right? You'd like to know for any given trip, what are the choices? What are the marginal costs of those choices, monetary, non-monetary, and then understand how people make those choices. And, we weren't able to really quite get into that level of detail, but we did a little bit. But when you start averaging costs in real life by having a subscription service so that you can blend the cost of long trips and short trips, you're paying some base amount per month, regardless of how many trips you take. And actually, the more trips you take, in a sense, the cheaper each one is, if it's that kind of a subscription, or even if it's a base price and then some cost markup, it really changes the economics dramatically. And so, we haven't looked at that, but I think it's a very interesting question. If you suddenly had an all-you-can-travel package for, whatever it is, $49 a month or something, or $99 a month, once people decide to get that subscription and they've paid that, then the marginal cost becomes very low or even zero. And so you would expect an awful lot of travel that way. So it's a very different situation. And often economists are trying to argue against doing that because you're taking away those marginal price signals.
It would all depend on like what kind of price the OEMs can offer to the public, and then I think, given that there is a realistic price that the OEM could give, it would be the next step to do a willingness to pay analysis to understand if people are actually willing to give up their own car in exchange of having like a membership sort of car access, and then I mean, there are also like the variables of like how much they can use it, if the availability is actually like available at any time they need it. So they give them essentially the same freedom as they own their own car. So I think the variables are many, but yeah. So it could be potentially part of like a future scenario of how to incentivize people to ditch their car ownership.
Hey, Mike, I see one more that I'd like to answer.
Go for it. Close this out.
The last one here about Uber and Lyft still losing money. And we know that, I don't know exactly, I haven't followed it that closely. I don't know exactly how much prices are going up, but I think the prices have gone up over the last year as they attempt to move more into a profit zone. We assumed a certain overhead rate on all these. This is showing up here in the pink or the beige color. But we acknowledge that, up until recently, at least, that's a money losing kind of number. And it's very unclear what happens if you start to raise that overhead rate, and eventually maybe you're earning enough for the company to turn a profit, but then it would change the relative choices of the cost of choices here. And you may find that demand for ride hailing goes down a lot. And maybe that's been happening as the prices have been going up. So that is a really interesting kind of follow-on study that could be done with what we've done here, is to look at changes in that overhead rate that on the one hand may give a higher profit margin or any profit margin for the company, but on the other hand, really depress the market for ride hailing.
And then there's also the aspects of the drivers. So like for the current scenario, this picture that we see here is the future, but like in the current scenarios, we have the drivers. So the drivers also like the offer.
If we go back to the
of
current,
the driver.
sorry.
It's also a one very important aspect of Uber situation.
That's right. Yeah.
Our assumption here in the chart is 35% overhead.
And the pink driver earnings are what basically, given the price per trip, what is left over and all the expenses down at the bottom here, what is left over for the drivers is how that's calculated.
We are right at the hour. Just putting a link in the chat for the survey for attendees to let us know how we did. Sorry that there's some other really great questions. So our apologies, we didn't get to all of them. But certainly, feel free to dig into those publications. You have Lou and Unia's contact information. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Lou and Unia, I really want to thank you both for sharing this work with us. Obviously, spurred a lot of interest, and I think we're all looking forward to seeing where you take it next. So thanks again, everyone, and please keep an eye out for our next webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.